Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Joining me today is Taj Carlson to talk about data. Taj, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So, Taj, tell me your superhero origin story. That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
I started working with nonprofits. It was so natural for me, right? Because I had always been working with, like from college on, I'd always been involved with social issues. My background is actually as a sociologist. So I was an academic briefly. So I guess I'm a recovering academic. And I went right from there into doing data work, but initially evaluation work with nonprofits, first as a consultant, then working on some larger federal evaluation projects that were interesting. And so I started doing evaluation work, and that's kind of where I got into using applied research after I left academia, and that was over 20 years ago. So when I started the company, so when I started Inciter 20 years ago, we were doing evaluation work. And I had a moment, which for me made me really passionate about working with nonprofits, specifically around technology and data. I had been hired to work with an HIV prevention organization in New York, New Jersey. And one of the things that I liked to do when I was working with someone around evaluation, which often was sort of data support, sometimes this particular project was, can you just look at all the stuff we've got and just try to pull it together? Now, keep in mind, this was probably more than 15 years ago. They had a bunch of paper folders, and I was like, we'll take it, we'll, put it in Excel, and we'll just give you some insight into the data that you're collecting. So that's where that project was at that time. So I asked if I could ride along in the HIV testing van because I like to get a sense of kind of the work that they're actually doing. And so they were gracious enough to let me do that. It seemed fine, with everyone. And so they're out there talking to people who are high risk. People would get in the van, they would take the test. So back then, it was 20 minutes before you knew the result of your HIV test. So it's a really important moment when they could counsel people on what they might do, like what their risk factors were, how they might protect themselves, because that was the 20 minutes when people were actively thinking about they don't know what their test result's going to be. And I sat and watched the person spend almost the entire 20 minutes filling out forms. And that was just heartbreaking because I knew how essential that was. So he's filling out his forms. I like a lot of it's for the CDC. It's for people like me. It's for evaluation and reporting stuff. Then we get back to the office, and I'm sitting with all of these. Me and my staff are like sitting with all of these folders and files, and we couldn't do anything with them because it's illegible. It's not entered properly, on the form in pen. We couldn't help them. We couldn't do anything with that. And that was the moment for me after having worked with nonprofits for a little bit where I'm just like, there's got to be a better way to do this. Like the FedEx person shows up with a thing in his hand, or her hand scans the thing. You have the information. It all goes, it's really clean. Nonprofits, there's got to be something better than this, scribbling things down on paper. So back then it was paper, but I feel like the mission for me is still very much the same around how can we bring technology to a space that isn't a technology space that's doing really important work and make it easier for them to manage their data so that they can get on with doing the work that they need to be doing.
I can't imagine the stress level that the person must be going through and the emotional state they must be going through trying to fill out this paper form. I'm sure that's one of the reasons why it was illegible, because it's just so emotional and so nervous and so uncertain about what the results are going to be.
The person filling out the form was the staff member. So
Oh,
it was
okay.
it was kinder than that, right? So you're not having to fill out forms. They were asking them questions
Okay, got it.
because, literacy levels and language and all that. So fortunately, the person waiting for the test is not filling out the form, but they are having to sit through this sort of annoying bureaucratic interview. So it's the staff member that's like doing all this work, though, while they're kind of trying to ask the other important questions and talk to them and figure out where they are. Yeah, so it was them. That's a slightly better situation than the one you're
Yeah,
imagining.
it is. But you're right. I mean, the end result is still the same in that it's paper. It's hard to transpose that to something that's actually usable, especially if the writing is not quite legible. Um,
Yeah, and you'll see
yeah.
that today still, right? You'll see people using case management software or
Yep.
other types of software, right, where they're trying to do their work and enter the data, and they're not separate, right? The person trying to actually do the work, whether it's membership management or case management or fundraising. They're trying to do the work and enter the data at the same time. And sometimes you end up with an electronic equivalent of those files with paper boxes I had to deal with.
Just to play devil's advocate for a second, I've heard that part of the reason why some institutions still use paper today, especially when asking these questions, and it's more one-on-one type of questions, asking someone who's in a bit more of a vulnerable position, is because it seems to be more personal versus either being in front of a computer or some other electronic device seems to, or it gets the impression that you divide the people together, divide the people that are involved. Do you have
Yeah,
any?
I agree. I think there's something to that, right? So we've worked with, for example, domestic violence service providers. So you're talking about a totally traumatized person, especially if it's hospital based, and you're having this conversation, and people have told us, and I think it can be done well, right? And also home visiting for at-risk moms. Like there's so much going on when you do a
Mhm.
home visit. So in those cases where people are in crisis, where they're traumatized, where there's a lot going on, where there are safety issues, I think it absolutely can make sense to use a pen and a clipboard. And I would say it's, I know we're gonna talk about data governance in a bit, but there's data governance that you can use with a pen and a clipboard as well. And I think that can be the most appropriate. And then you need sensitivity to who's doing the job and what is the context in which they're doing the job. And we've also had situations where people do not need to be bringing electronic devices that are valuable into the context in which they're working. So you need to be
Right.
sensitive to that as well. So yeah, those can definitely be issues. And then it's just about paying attention. Like if you're on the ground doing the work, what is the context in which you're doing the work? And we're always focused on like, how can you just make it better, right? You don't need to go from nothing's been filled out to you're using some crazy, tablet scanner. You just can you move it along a little bit in the direction of better data quality?
So the goal is better data quality and reporting on that data as well, right? Would you say those are your two main elements of focus, not just the data itself and how the data is stored or used, but moreover how it is used in the context of reporting?
Yeah, I would say that that's our end goal, in the area where we really focus the most is reporting. So where you need to report on that data internally, externally, to funders, to members, and what's needed in order to do that. So theoretically, you could be collecting data and just storing it for archival purposes. And cleaning and processing data is something we do in a lot of contexts, but usually we're helping organizations that are struggling to get reports, which could mean reports within a system, but it often means reports across different systems.
Is there any particular driving factor that made you decide that reporting and data is your main area of focus?
So, back when we did mostly evaluation work, which we still do a little bit of, we struggled. We saw so many of our clients struggling to get the data together for us so that we could do those reports. I also found that they were having the same struggle to do the reports for themselves. And it was a few things. So, one of them was that people just told me, we don't want a bigger system or a new system. We want the systems that we have to play well together. And
Hmm.
that was like another light bulb moment for me several years ago. And I'm like, oh, nobody needs a new system. I mean, maybe they do, right? Obviously, system selection is really important and there's the right fit systems, but sometimes the systems are fine in their silos. The fundraising people are happy with their system, and the membership people are happy with their system, and the case managers are happy, but they need to pull data from across those systems. And so, again and again, I talked to people and watched people who I've had people say, I've got a staff person and their entire job is just pulling data into spreadsheets across the systems and trying to make heads or tails out of it. I've had organizations say we spent all summer, especially educational organizations, we spent all summer just trying to put this report together. So not only there's one thing that was motivating for me, which was funders require reports And then I want to make sure that you're managing your data in a way that you have what you need, because funders don't always ask for things that are helpful to the organization itself, right? But also that there's an efficiency around people who, especially, well, people who either don't have the right skill set or don't really need that skill set or should be doing something else with the skills they have, not spending a huge amount of time doing manual, cleaning and aggregating of data to get the information that they need. And often then by the time they're done doing it, it's several months old as well. So, and then the other thing that made us want to help was the turnover, right? So you'll have people come in and there's somebody who knows that system or that method or who's been doing all that work with the spreadsheets, and then they leave. And so we also sometimes can serve as a sort of a stabilizer, that we sort of can hold that piece, or help an organization and counsel them towards, like, you need to have some kind of way to step in when that person leaves, documentation, boring things like that, right? So that it doesn't live with one person. So there's just a lot of disruption and stress and frustration that we were seeing. And I think there was a lot of folks saying, you need a new technology tool, but we really felt like we wanted to be tool agnostic. And how can we there's so many ways you can put everything together, especially given the current state of data engineering tools, without having to switch how you're entering and using your systems day to day. So watching all those things really made us want to focus on reporting.
I really appreciate the fact that you mentioned that organizations don't necessarily need to change their tech, and that maybe it's good enough for what they're trying to do. And it's now a matter of extracting the data and the useful data from those systems, especially if it's across silos, because too many people want to just throw out the current tech and go for a new tech, hoping that'll solve all their issues, when then in case, in fact, it may or may not. I mean, you're right. There are some moments where it will, but more often than not, it won't.
That's right. That's right. You're right. And I think the couple of things that we have seen a lot recently is people who their system is not properly configured. So that can happen with Salesforce, that can happen with HubSpot, that can happen with, a lot of things. So sometimes when we go in and do an assessment, we'll say, you need a really good consultant who understands the system, and just let them re-architect it for you, right? Let them change the configurations. It could work a lot better for you. And so I find that really rewarding, actually, even though that's not what we do. But when you can see, like, oh, you've got something that could really work much better for you. The other thing is sometimes they have a system or systems, and because they don't have good methods and protocols for managing their data generally, they've got kind of a mess, because they're not communicating with each other about what the data means, how it should be entered, what the standards are, they just don't have good practices in the organization. And so that's a couple of things we see that you can address without having to change your technology. Because the other thing is, changing technology, it's a huge organizational change burden, right? It's a huge,
Oh yeah.
just making people do what they do every day differently. I mean, everybody knows if you've ever changed the technology you use personally, or even sometimes if you upgrade your OS, if you switch from Windows to Mac or back, it takes you quite a while to get back up to speed. And so it's a lot to ask of an organization to switch technologies unless you know that there's a benefit. Now, sometimes people are using, really, really old SQL or Access databases on premises, and they really do need to switch for scaling, for security, for other reasons. But a lot of times they're using fairly solid cloud-based software solutions, vendor solutions that can work okay for them. Oh, I also like the other thing that you said, which was pull out the necessary data. That's important, right? Because sometimes people want to just dump everything. And it's really helpful and you can do that and have that conversation internally. Like, what's really important? Like, what do we really need, especially when you're doing integration or migration? A good conversation to have.
Don't knock Microsoft Access. I've been using it for 20 years now. But yeah, no, it's a joke.
It depends on what's in it and where it is, right? It can work pretty well. Yeah. I mean, we love Excel spreadsheets too. Don't get me wrong.
No. Access is much better. But you're right. It's not a cloud-based. It's not scalable. It's great for one person to do some data analysis, but I wouldn't go further. It struck a chord with me because I'm kind of trying to revitalize Access as a tool to help analyze data to a certain extent, because obviously there's only so much you can do, but it is part of the 360 suite from Microsoft. So it's a low cost solution as opposed to using some of these more fancy tools. So
Mhm.
anyway, it's just a sidebar on that one.
I'll further sidebar you. There's
Sure.
also we encountered an interesting challenge that I had never thought about when we were talking to a potential client. There are folks who need to keep data, and when they delete it, they need to know it's deleted. So if that is a situation for you, access was it's still in the cloud though, isn't it, on Office 365? So there are ways to also think about you might need something hosted in a very specific way that's not through a cloud provider. If when it's deleted, you need to know it's actually deleted and not recoverable because most systems are designed to be recoverable. So that's like a little interesting twist we came across recently.
Yeah, and to go one step further, you can use Access locally. You don't need to have it on the cloud. You can store it locally on your machine. Obviously, you need
Right.
to have proper security and governance on that one as well. But that is a case where if you do delete the record from Access on your local computer, it's gone.
Yeah. So that could be a really good use case for it. It's really just the right tool for the right situation, right?
Right. Okay, but going back to I like your comment as well, more data versus useful data. So I imagine that some people think, well, the more data you have, the better you are because you can just figure out more trends versus having useful data. So how would you differentiate between just the data itself or more data and the useful data? Where's I know it's probably not a straight line or it's more of a gray line, but between the two, but how would you help organizations decide what is actually useful data versus what is just data?
Yeah, I'll tell you how we do it, especially now that I've talked about the context we work in, right? So we focus on reporting. And so one of the things that we do with clients is when we first work with them, we do an assessment of their data systems. We look at the data systems, we look at the data outputs, and then we have a talk with them, lots of talks about what are the reports that you need, not just like these are the ones we're getting right now, because some people have a report and they're only using half of it. So really going through the reports that they get right now, having the conversation about is it valuable, who's it valuable to, how is it valuable, what else do you really need to know, and then we create a diagram that maps the reports back to the sources. So that's been really helpful for us to say, okay, this is the information I need. This is where it comes from, the format it needs to be in, and map it all the way back to usually multiple systems. And the diagram also indicates this information in this report comes from these 2 or 3 systems, and so it has to be pulled from these fields in these systems in this way and combined. That doesn't necessarily mean that the other data isn't valuable. So that's what I mean by the context we work in. But it just means that for our purposes of helping with reporting and what you need for reports, that's how we identify the most important fields in the different systems that are needed for the reports. Sometimes in that process, it becomes clear that there are things that are very clearly not useful because people will say, oh, we've got, you'll be looking at the output and they'll say, we've got all this stuff and this is from 5 years ago, and this is a funder we don't have or a program we don't have anymore. Or we don't need, you can find that out, but it's less likely that we would do a full scale, your entire organization, and we focus more on the reporting piece of it.
For an organization that has these silos that you mentioned, let's imagine a scenario. You've got Microsoft Access, you've got Salesforce, and you've got HubSpot, and each of them has data which may or may not overlap to a certain extent. How would an organization like that tackle trying to build some kind of holistic reporting tool, or at least build some sense out of all these 3 different systems, which may not be directly connected to each other?
So it depends on their resources. And by that, I mean more skills and expertise than, of course, it's not unrelated to financial resources, but it really depends on like what skills do you have in house? How big is the organization? What does the org chart look like? What's available to you? Because you can do that with Excel, right? You can absolutely, and people do it all the time, and it's not a problem if it's the best fit. You can pull the data from each of the systems. You can, create a new spreadsheet with the combined data across the three systems by looking at sort of what fields do you need and how do you need to have it combined. and you can push that into, for example, Power BI, or you could push it into Tableau, or you could push it into, another tool. That can work well if it's not a ton of data, if it's not a ton of systems, if you have the staff available to do that and who know how to do that. And that's a bit easier of a thing to know than what I'll talk about. It's sort of the other options. And you don't need it, and it depends on how often you need it to update, right? So there's the amount of the data, the sources of data. Most systems are not too hard to get a CSV file out of. And there are also systems that we work with that don't have very robust APIs, and sometimes will default to a CSV. But an organization can do that, and I think that they have to then look at, do we have the skill set in house? You might, if you've got an analyst or even an accidental data analyst. Does it get us what we need? Is it something we can replicate? Does it end up depending on one person? And if it does, sometimes that just means you need to document your processes. And then can we disseminate the information in the way that we need to? And there's like a whole probably hour-long conversation on licensing for Power BI and for Tableau. And that whole issue is sort of how you share information within the organization, if you need to share it outside of the organization, if you need to be able to put it on a website and show it to the world, and what the licensing costs of that are. Like, that's a very complicated topic, but it's definitely relevant to your decision making. Or are you all in the office, you just need to share with each other? Do you just have one or two or three people that really need to look at the output? And by output, you're usually looking at visualizations at that point too, which is the other reason I was passionate about reporting, is because I have a master's in information visualization. So that end of it was also really exciting in terms of delivering the information in a way that is easy for everyone to understand. So I think that's a great place to start. I think when you get to we have a lot of data, we want this to happen more frequently, we want more automation, we maybe want to use some Python to do the cleaning, we don't want to do all that by hand, then you start going in a slightly different direction. Some organizations build an internal sort of data analytics, data engineering department, right, where they have somebody who can do that. And what that process usually looks like is that you're going to pull data from each of those systems, and then you usually load it into a warehouse, because you need a central place where you can transform the data, and a place that you can store it. And then you make a decision about how you want to connect that again to your reporting or visualization sources. So you could have stuff in a warehouse that you then connect to Tableau or to Power BI. I'm saying Tableau and Power BI and Metabase. Those are the three BI tools that we use, so I'm most familiar with them. So you could do it that way, and then you've got a warehouse, and you would need to build those pipelines there, right? So you could have, again, a more manual process of pulling the information, cleaning it, loading it into your warehouse. You could also have a more automated process where that happens automatically. And there's a lot of different ways that looks. And one of the things we've discovered is it doesn't always involve the level of coding that people think it might, but it does involve the level of sort of knowledge of data management and data management systems. And what I mean by that is, I think everybody, because APIs are so popular, I think everybody thinks you just connect to an API and you're done, right? It just does everything you need it to. But sometimes we find that that's not an appropriate situation. And either it's because the API may not be as robust as we want, or we can't quite get what we want with it. Or the other thing that happens is sometimes we have an organization with, and this is another factor, when you've got multiple, like member organizations is a good example. You've got member organizations, they're not part of your organization, but you need to be able to pull data from them. And this can happen in a lot of different scenarios. I'm thinking of an association, but we also have lots of social service agencies where you might have, community schools across the state that need to roll up their data. And in that case, you've got several different, everybody's using a different system to store their data, and you need to roll it up, and you're not going to be able to connect to 20 different systems that 20 different member organizations use. And so that's another great case. Like, CSVs are really valuable for a lot of things. It's not always the super custom automated technology solution. So when you go that direction, then you need someone who can manage a data warehouse. So that's a significant, I would say, level up. And I think that's why a lot of organizations do pull things out in Excel. And that can work well for them. If they have the staff, the expertise, they're getting what they need. If they have good data governance practices, that can work really well. When they either want to outsource it or build a department around it and have things be more automated, then they usually go with the data warehousing solution. And then again, connecting it to an appropriate BI tool that works for them. And then the one thing too about connecting to the BI tools is sometimes people connect to a BI tool and then they process or transform the data in the BI tool, which is a little tricky because there's not usually a great way to push that back to the warehouse. So that's just something you need to be careful of. That's one of the reasons that we like Metabase, is because it's hosted on our warehouse.
If I were to do just a quick high level system diagram, so you got on the left side, let's say, the various source systems, right? We mentioned Access, Salesforce, HubSpot is, let's say, 3. Then either through some kind of CSV extract or an API, typically they would go to a data warehouse, which is in the middle. And on the right side, your BI tool like Power BI or Tableau or Metabase would be the one that visualizes and crunches the data that's in the warehouse. Is that more or less a typical scenario?
That's a pretty typical scenario. We kind of like to crunch the data in the warehouse, and that
Mhm.
way you could even connect it to multiple BI tools, but the data will be consistent. But you can pull it into, and people do pull it into Power BI and Tableau, and then crunch it. But then it lives there, right? And so then you have to just pay attention to kind of what got transformed where. So yeah, that's absolutely right. The left side is sort of wherever it's coming from, systems, CSV tool, CSV sheets, like whichever, and then the diagram would have, right, the pipelines, the various pipelines that are pulling the information into the data warehouse in the middle, where things get stored, cleaned, aggregated, potentially crunched, and then connecting on the right side to one or more BI tools. I mean, you could have, if you use the warehouse as your single source of truth, then you could use Power BI and Tableau in the same organization.
What would be the advantage of having more than one BI tool? And I mean, I could say that would, if there is an advantage, that makes sense then to have the central source of truth as the data warehouse, because like you said, you can crunch the numbers as opposed to crunching them in the individual BI tools. But like, why would you want to have more than one BI tool?
I wouldn't. Well, I wouldn't for Power BI and for Tableau. I think sometimes people want to do it because maybe finance is using Power BI and membership is using Tableau. You might, or sometimes people also like Tableau better for communications. I don't think it's a good idea. I'll just say that you could do it. I don't think it's a good idea because then I think you have sort of a proliferation of visualizations and dashboards. But you could have one department that likes Power BI and another department that uses Tableau. We I think you could more effectively use Metabase because it's directly connected to the warehouse, and you can do SQL queries in Metabase and a lot of other things directly, and then also have another BI tool because, again, I think it's more comfort. People are just like, we're used to using this, we know how to use this. It's preferable to have one BI tool, but especially in large organizations where people are really wedded to certain solutions, you can work with having more than one.
You've mentioned also data warehouse, and I've heard the word data lake before as well. How would you define a data warehouse versus a data lake, and when would you use one over another?
Yeah, so a data lake is a big pool of raw data, right? So it's raw data, usually coming from multiple sources. It's usually unstructured data, and a data warehouse is structured, filtered data that's already been processed for a specific purpose. So I think I'll speak to our purposes. We tend to just use data warehouses because we want, again, because of that thing we were talking about bringing the necessary data in, because we're usually looking at using it for reporting. A data lake can quickly become a data swamp, which is where you're just dumping everything in there. And I think a large organization with really solid data governance processes and the resources to support a data lake could use it because it can be more efficient. And then you're like, everything's here. And then when you need to query and you need to build and you need to build a data mart or other things, I want to now pull out of the data lake and have something that just answers these questions. Often you'll use that in my experience so far, nonprofits tend to not be large, have large enough data sets to really need data lakes. And I'm sure somebody will prove me wrong on this soon, and that's fine. Um, they often don't have the expertise to manage a data lake without, or the data governance practices to do that without it getting kind of out of hand. So things are just piling up in there. And then there's two other risks of just pulling in all your raw data and having it hang out there is, in my experience, retention and issues like that are going to be easier in the source system versus trying to do that in a data lake. And also, everything you put in the data lake, you're paying for, right? Because everything scales. So, one of the reasons we use a warehouse and just pull in the data that we want and pull it in kind of already processed and structured is because we want to only have what we want, and we want to have it already structured for the reporting functions. And again, that's somewhat a factor of what we do and the fact that we focus on reporting.
There's obviously a lot of decisions to be made here. What tools to use, how to use them, processes, practices. Um, and we've talked, or you mentioned the data governance element. Like, could you speak a bit more about how data governance helps a nonprofit organization just make sense of out of all of this data, and where to go with it and what to do with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people think about data governance. I mean, it's really applying formality to your processes, right? I think a lot of people think of data governance as something you do because you're trying to avoid something, usually risk or being out of compliance. And it does serve that purpose. One of the things that we like to talk to clients about is, data governance is really just a way to have better, more trustworthy data. It's a way for your data to be more reliable, for you to have alignment across the organization. And I really think of data governance as, we think of it as like, it's not that you have it or you don't, because everyone's doing data governance. Every time you make a decision, every time you clean some data, every time you identify a data source or a data use, you're doing data governance. And so I think for me, what's more motivating is to think about data governance and the way that it reduces stress, frustration, and waste. Because there's so many times when we've taken data and processed it, and we've seen clients do this, and then they get reports and they're like, this report's not right, right? I don't trust this. And often you'll go the technology route and build the thing, and you can pull in data in and you can crunch it, and then be like, this is just the data, I can't crunch it, or I can't trust the report because everybody recorded this a different way, or because nobody noticed what this field means, or the data's missing. So I like to think that organizations should focus on what's most important for them, which is going to be very different. So instead of, there's this data governance standard and we've all got to meet it, which sort of, smacks of HIPAA, and I think it kind of scares people. It just kind of thinking about what are our processes and practices around data, who decides about data, who implements those decisions, and then who are the end users of that. And I think thinking about that and making decisions, like the simplest aspect of data governance is making decisions. Somebody has to decide, what do we call things? How do we record things? Where do we store things? How do we protect, by things, I mean data. How do we protect our data? How do we identify sensitive data? And I think people also think often that data governance is going to be this giant council, right? But often you just need to figure out what are the roles for those, like who makes the decision, how is it made, but then also communicating about it. You can make the decisions about how you identify sensitive data, but if no one knows you made that decision, it's not going to be very helpful. And so this is where communication and training and consistency, and again, sort of documentation, sort of having things written down so that the analysts in different departments, if you have analysts in different departments, can look and say, okay, this is how we do this. And I feel like data governance is, I almost wish it had another name in some way, because it feels like this other thing that you do. But in many ways, all organizations that want to be effective and function at a high level do these things. It's operations. It's like data operations, deciding, implementing, communicating, and then holding accountable as well, right? If you're supposed to be entering the data in this way, if you're supposed to be running these reports to check for data quality, and then when you find data quality issues, your role is to then send it to this person to address it or to clean it in this way. Once you lay that out, you also have to hold people accountable for that. But that's not that different than anywhere else in the organization. So we like to think about it as you already know how to do it. It's just thinking about it in a more organized and focused manner.
It also sounds like something you do and improve over time. I like the idea that it's not a binary yes or no, we have it or we don't. It's more like grades, shades of gray. And you want to get, I don't know if you want to go lighter or darker, but the idea is you want to just improve over time, and reiterate the process so that it does improve over time. It's not a one-stop shop. It's a feedback mechanism as well.
That's right. It's continuous. It's continuous. And this is why I think, again, people get scared of it because to some extent it's kind of a new term. Like I'd say it's been around, I don't know, in the last 10 years. And some people don't really know what it means. And then if you ever, God forbid, go Google it on the internet and you see all the stuff that has been written from this like IT perspective, nothing against IT, they're just using it differently, right? Between the language barrier and the often the level of complexity of the organizations that are talking about it, which sometimes don't relate to like a mid-sized nonprofit, it can be very daunting. But it really is something that you are already doing, even if you haven't consciously made the decision or written it down, or you're not holding people accountable. And so the key is to find out where are you and how can we just move you more in the direction of having better data governance. And that might be figuring out what's your biggest risk if that's your driver, but it could also be what's your biggest waste, right? Where are you wasting the most time with people in different departments having to talk to each other because they're not sure how we're going to do this time, and you really want to say this is how we're going to do it every time.
What are some of the benefits of having a good, or at least data governance? You mentioned a couple of them, like just now, the waste one, but is there any other specific benefits, targets that nonprofits can aim towards to say, this is a meaningful endeavor. We definitely need to improve our data governance, and here are the reasons why.
Yeah, I mean, the risk and compliance thing will often get people's attention, and it is something you can talk about if that's relevant for you, right? If we don't know where our data is, if we haven't identified where the sensitive data is, if we don't have protocols for protecting it, that is risky. You can usually look around in your day to day and figure out ways in which data governance is taking a lot of time for people. So every time we run this report, we have to go through like a 4-day process to clean this up by hand because everybody, very basic example, everybody's entering the date in a different format. That's an example, right? And for each organization, it might be different. For other people, it might be we've got multiple addresses for people and we don't know which one is right. And so we can't fundraise to them effectively, or we're sending fundraising calls out to far more people than necessary, which is wasting a lot of time and money. So I think the best way to do it is to be specific to your organization instead of saying we should do data governance, but say this is happening in our organization because we haven't identified where our sensitive data is, because we don't have quality assurance protocols, because we don't have clear roles and we don't know who's supposed to do what, or somebody different does it every quarter, right? It's like hot potato. And this is the problem that causes. And so I think being really specific to your day-to-day experience is really helpful in that way. And that way it's not like, oh, here comes some initiative that we can't really understand or relate to and it's going to take a lot of time. Be very specific. And if we could figure this out, then this is what will happen and this is what it's costing us now. And sometimes it's cost, right? We're losing members. Members aren't getting to our events. We didn't get a grant because we didn't, our data was such a mess that we couldn't figure out, or we're going to be fined, right? All of those. So really understanding what it's costing you now and what the benefit would be later, I think is the best way to get buy-in. And personally, I think the best way also is to approach it in this way, right? Is to say, we just want to do this piece and move in that direction. Sometimes I almost think about it like your crazy kitchen drawer that's full of everything. It's really great to go into the kitchen drawer and sort of clean it out. but it's, and it's rewarding. But later on, at some point, you need to say what goes in the drawer, what does not go in the drawer, who's allowed to put things in the drawer. And then you stop having to clean the drawer out every 2 weeks.
I love that visualization. And I would also add to document this stuff. To your point earlier with employee churn, as long as it's documented, hopefully there's a smoother transition as people take on their new role so that you do have some kind of consistency across over the years, basically.
Yes, documentation is so important, and nobody's going to throw a party for documentation, but it is phenomenally important in terms of avoiding firefighting and stress. And so it's one of those things where you just got to say the future version of our organization and our future staff, or, current staff in the future, are really going to appreciate this if we can do this. And the other thing I'll just mention that we find is sometimes there's an interesting struggle, challenge to when someone leaves to get people access to systems. So this is another thing to think about in terms of documentation and processes. You've got multiple systems. It isn't necessarily just your Salesforce and your HubSpot and your AMS, but it could also be your Dropbox or your Power BI login. Or so it's interesting to me how often, because we often need to get access, and people say, I don't know who controls access to that system. So that's another example of, when you're documenting and creating roles, like who is responsible for managing access to the different systems, not just so you can remove access, which is obviously important from a security perspective, but also within an organization, it sometimes takes weeks for somebody in an organization to get access to a system. And that's, I think, one of those things that kind of falls through the cracks.
It definitely also sounds like a organization-wide effort. This is not probably something that's run in its own little silo, the data governance. There has to be buy-in from multiple people, all the way up to the board of directors, perhaps. And I know that there's quite a few terms used for people in various roles dealing with data. Off the top of my head, I can think of data governors, data owners, data stewards, data analysts. It reminds me of the Marvel movie Ant-Man, where we just add the word data in front of a lot of different other
It's
words,
so
like they were
true.
adding the word quantum in front of every other word. But is there actually a meaningful difference between some of these roles, or are they just different flavors of the same essence?
So I actually did a bit of a deep dive on this a while ago, and I was looking at all the roles. And the thing is that there's different frameworks, and there are some frameworks that have, like 20 data governance roles. And are they meaningfully different? Yes. Are they all appropriate for your organization? Unknown, right? So I think it's one of these sort of language proliferations things that can lead to more confusion than clarity. I think what you have to do is, in your organization, decide what you call them, communicate that very consistently. And if you can align it with existing job titles or known language that you use, that's fine, right? Like you want to use the term that makes the most sense to your organization. I do like to think about um, that there's a role for people who create policies and processes, right? Or who decide about policies and processes. So that's a thing that's important to know in the organization. You can call it anything. You might call it a data governor, right? That's, some people call it a data governor. You probably don't want to call it something that might confuse people from other organizations using other terms. But we haven't really settled on the terms. I would argue there's like lots of terms. Some people like data champion, but that can mean a lot of different things in different organizations. But I would say it's important to think about who creates policies and processes, who ensures that they are carried out. That might be a data governor. Who implements the data strategy, right? Who implements those decisions, who carries those decisions out. You might call that a data owner. And then some people talk about data stewards. And again, whatever name you use is fine. Somebody who thinks about how to classify and categorize information. This is often someone who is a domain expert, right? So it's hard if you're in finance, it's hard for somebody in membership to classify your data. So you might even have a data steward in each organizational unit. that sort of understands and classifies and categorizes information. And then you could even think of some people who are data users who don't do any of those other things. They don't create policies, they don't implement, they don't classify. Their end users. Whether you need all those, I think, is a very, very big question. What you call them is totally up to you, right? So yeah, it is kind of like let's put data in front of everything. And so you may have titles that align more with your organization. And I think we're very much still working out what the roles are. And the bigger the organization, the more incredibly complex you'll see the roles being, and that can be overwhelming as well. So
I know we're winding down the conversation, and this next topic could be a discussion for an hour in itself. But I'm just curious to know, high level, what is your vision or your perception of AI and how it's used to analyze data? Because one of the use cases I hear often is it has the ability, of course, of crunching massive amounts of data and producing really simple results almost magically. So it really helps the analysis
mhm.
part of data. I'm curious to know if you have any, what's your experience so far in leveraging AI to help analyze data?
So I would say that we are upstream from that for the most part because we're keeping an eye on it and we're always looking at new, ways of managing data to see if there's anything there we need to use. I would I would argue that in order to effectively use AI, and I'm not an AI expert, you need, like you said, large amounts of data. So first of all, do our clients have large amounts of data? Maybe, maybe not. But then is the data in a condition that it can benefit from AI? And we are often dealing with, even with large nonprofits, that need to deal with the other issues first before they start to do this very advanced meaning making. Because if you haven't really thought through what the data is for, its classification, its importance, its quality, if you're not doing that consistently, you run the risk of, and this is another one of those, getting the technology before the fundamentals. You run the risk of saying, let's do something with AI, and then you could engage in a very expensive or complex AI process to find your data didn't really meet the criteria to be able to use AI. We do use machine learning a lot for cleaning. Like I think machine learning is great for sort of cleaning and processing information, and that very much applies to our work around getting the data ready and available for analysis. And then I think it still remains to be seen how you might use AI in the context of integrating data across different silos and using it for reporting. And I think because the bigger challenge for us is the integration and getting it all in one place. And the analysis that we're tending to do with people tends to be doesn't tend to require AI just yet. But it's going to keep changing. Obviously, it's a big topic. It's a big growth area, and we do look at what's happening in the field at large because it rolls down and then eventually it gets to a place where we like to sort of find where can we make it right fit for our space.
Actually, I really appreciate that perspective because some people might consider, we have to use AI. It's available to us. Let's find a way to use it. But I prefer the idea of it's just another tool, and
Mm-hmm.
let's make sure we use it not only responsibly, but also make sure we use it properly in compliance with everything else we've set up, and not just let it get the horse in front of the carriage or the carriage in front of the horse perspective. Like let's use it in context of where we're trying to get to and not just because everyone is using it, therefore we need to use it.
Yeah, it's not that different from multi-level statistical modeling, right? How many people have run advanced predictive statistical models with data sets that weren't at all appropriate for it, or without even having a good research question lined up? It's not that different than that. Yeah, it's the right tool for the right situation.
Awesome. Well, on that note, Taj, thank you so much for joining me. I'm curious to know, or if you could please share with the audience ways that people can reach out to you or your organization if they have any follow-up questions or feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. If you go to our website, which is inciter.io, you can follow our blog. You can also book a free consultation if you'd like to chat with me. We also are on Twitter and LinkedIn, and so you can find us in either one of those places. And we have a monthly newsletter, not too often, where we also post our new blog post and then a few other tidbits. And we are right now doing a series on data governance. So if you want to follow along with us on the data governance blog post series, feel free to join the newsletter.
Awesome, Taj. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.